Daniel Carter came home after 4 years, the straps of his pack still etched into his shoulders. He thought the door would open, but Marianne set an old suitcase on the steps and closed it in his face. Rain streaked his uniform gray. Behind her, Franklin stood with folded arms, a thin smile blocking all the light inside. Under the porch, Lily clutched a soaked teddy bear. Jacob looked up and whispered, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" And in that moment, the father knew, the battle deeper than war had just begun. The first winter rain came down like a heavy curtain, hiding the dirt road that led back to town. Daniel kept walking, the faded backpack dragging on his shoulders, the straps cutting red marks into his skin, sharp and raw, like even his own body wanted to reject carrying another piece of the past. His steps slapped against the wet ground in a quick, uneven rhythm, the same kind of drumbeat he once heard in the night, far away in a place of bombs and gun smoke. He'd always imagined this homecoming differently, a porch light on, the sound of his child's feet running, arms waiting for him. But that was just wishful thinking. Through the gray rain, the house appeared. 4 years of war seemed to shrink into that single moment. The porch was still there, the wooden siding more faded, the windows dirty, moss spreading on the steps. Daniel froze, his hand gripping the strap until his knuckles went white, his heart pounding like it was trying to break out of his chest. Rain cut across his face, seeping into his collar, cold to the bone. He took a deep breath, trying to believe that if he climbed the steps, the door would open and swallow the loneliness that had followed him through every night in the bunkers. But the door didn't open with welcome. It opened with the squeal of old hinges and a cold face. Marianne. Her eyes weren't the same ones that had once waved goodbye to him under that porch roof. They were flat, distant. The eyes of a stranger facing the wrong delivery man. No words. Just one clean move, she tossed an old suitcase onto the steps. The thud of metal against wood mixed with the rain, sharp and hollow, cutting into Daniel's ears. He didn't move. His body locked, like all the weight of his life pressed down into his heels. Rain ran down from his hair to his neck, mixing with the dust from the long bus ride. Slowly, his hand trembled as he picked up the suitcase. The fabric was frayed, a corner split open, covered in mud. The sight dragged him back to the war, the rows of duffel bags stacked in tents, some left behind when men pulled out at night, never to be claimed again. His chest tightened. That old fear of being abandoned for good came rushing back. He lifted his head, but the door was already shut. Only the rain tapping the roof. No voice. No reason. Just silence thick enough to choke on. Daniel felt himself shaking, not from the cold, but from a different kind of terror. The realization that the war hadn't stayed overseas. It had followed him home, changing its shape, from gunfire to averted eyes, from trenches to a closed door in his own house. He stood there for a long time. The rain blurred everything, but that blur only made the truth sharper. This homecoming wasn't a celebration. It was a verdict. Daniel wiped his face with a soaked hand, then clenched it into a fist. The slow truth hit him: wars don't end when the guns stop. They live on in memory, in the way people turn away, in the silence that replaces answers. The past was here, standing with him on the porch, wearing the face of estrangement. A gust of wind pressed his uniform shirt tight against his thin frame. Looking down, he saw the stains of mud and road dust mixed with rain into dull gray streaks. That shirt had once been a shield, a mark of honor. Now it felt like proof of how out of place he was. And yet, in that grayness, something stirred: resilience. He was still standing. He hadn't collapsed. He could still breathe, even with heavy lungs. He could still grip the old suitcase, even with trembling hands. Each raindrop hitting the road sounded like a push: keep moving, keep moving. Daniel stepped back once, then again, his eyes fixed on the dark house. Nobody else needed to see it, he understood. From this moment on, the road ahead wasn't paved with asphalt, but with fear and determination. He feared being swallowed by the past, but he also knew the only way forward was to face it, step by step, breath by breath. In the quiet of the storm, Daniel turned away. The strap burned on his shoulder, but this time it felt less like a burden and more like a reminder: he had carried worse. He had survived fire and loss, and he could survive this door shutting on him. The past wasn't gone, but he could carry it with him, away from here. He pulled the strap tighter and walked straight into the thick rain. His figure blurred into the storm, small but unbroken. And in that emptiness, a seed of resilience took root, quiet, but impossible to kill. The door slammed shut with a flat, final sound. To Daniel, it rang in his ears like the click of a rifle bolt locking in place, firm, merciless, leaving no room for hope. That sound sliced the air, froze everything for a beat, then dropped them all into the pit of silence. The two kids pressed tight against his back, their small hands trembling. Lily clutched a worn-out teddy bear, its fur clumped from the rain, seemed split open to show the ragged cloth inside. Jacob looked up, wide-eyed, and whispered a question so sharp it cut. "Dad, what did I do wrong?" Daniel turned slightly toward them. For that brief moment, the world went quiet, just the hard rain hammering the porch roof, and his own heart pounding like it wanted out of his chest. His 8-year-old boy, eyes still as clear as a summer morning he had missed, was waiting for an answer. An answer Daniel couldn't give. Fear gripped him. The fear that the wounds of war weren't his alone, that they might seep into those young eyes, teaching them to carry pain they never caused. He bent down, wrapping both kids into his arms, pulling them close. 3 bodies pressed together like a small island in the storm. Rain beat against his neck, soaking through his collar, but the warmth of their breath against his chest reminded him he was alive, reminded him he had a reason to stay on his feet. The suitcase lay in the mud like proof of rejection. Daniel picked it up, then forced himself down the steps, not looking back. The old truck sat nearby, a dark, rust-scarred hulk in the rain. To Daniel, it looked like the last fortress he had. He opened the door, lifted the kids onto the seat. The metal was ice-cold, making Lily shiver. Daniel set the suitcase on the floor, then climbed behind the wheel. When he pulled the door shut, it cut off the sound of the rain outside, but not the noise tearing inside his chest. That night, their breath fogged the glass, circles of condensation spreading and smearing, like the smoke he once saw in the bunkers, soldiers sitting quiet, nobody speaking, silence pressing down. Outside, the rain kept falling steady, endless, like a sentence without appeal. Daniel sat at the wheel, hands loose, staring into the dark ahead. In the rear view, he saw the kids curled together, heads resting on each other. Lily held the teddy tight like a shield. Jacob's fingers clung to the edge of Daniel's shirt, locked there, as if letting go might bring the whole world down. Daniel reached his rough hand back and laid it on his son's back. A small gesture, but enough to hold the connection. He thought of nights in the war, no rain then, just the bombs dropping like their own storm. Lying flat in the dirt with his unit, waiting, scared that any round could be the last. Now, in this truck, the same fear returned, but with a different face. Fear of not keeping a roof, not protecting the eyes looking to him for safety. The fear cut into him. But then something else rose quietly, the truth that the past doesn't vanish, it only changes form. This battle wasn't gunfire anymore. It was the rain drumming on the cab, the quick breath of 2 kids pressed close. If war had taught him how to survive, now he had to learn how to stand for them. Time crawled in that truck. The old dashboard clock ticked with a tiny sound that felt too loud. Daniel never closed his eyes. Each time the wind rocked the frame, he tightened his grip on the wheel, like a watchman waiting for something unnamed. Slowly, the kids' breathing steadied, pulling them into uneasy sleep. Their heads leaned against each other, fragile in a way that told Daniel he had no right to collapse. By dawn, the windows were heavy with condensation, streaked with rain not yet dry. Pale light cut through, showing Daniel's tired face. Sunken eyes, dark circles, but in them a small, stubborn light. Fear wouldn't disappear. It would follow him. But seeing it clearly, facing it straight, that was its own kind of strength. He reached over, brushed Lily's damp hair back, pulled the thin blanket tighter around both children. He sat upright, drawing a long breath of the cold morning air. The rain no longer sounded like a sentence. Now, it sounded like a drumbeat, reminding him that every day was another fight and that he, even shaking, even shut out of his own house, was still here to fight it. Outside, the storm was easing, but inside Daniel the battle wasn't over. The difference was, in this damp cab, he'd found something, a small seed of resilience, sparked by their breath, by that sharp question he couldn't answer. He didn't have the words, but he had a silent vow, no matter what, he would never let them believe they were the ones at fault. The mistake wasn't in the children. The mistake was in the door that had slammed shut. And with that vow, Daniel started his heart again. The truck stayed still, the road ahead long, but he knew the real journey for the three of them was only just beginning. Morning broke gray and thin, the rain still tapping down in light drops on the roof of the truck, like a reminder the night hadn't really ended. Daniel sat stiff in the driver's seat, his back aching, his head foggy after going a full night without sleep. Behind him, the kids' breathing came in short bursts, tightening in their dreams and then softening again into shallow sleep. Through the fogged-up glass, he stared out at the road ahead. Rain streaks ran down the windshield, smearing everything outside until it looked like a picture rubbed out by a cold hand. As the pale daylight crept into the cab, Daniel knew he couldn't let the kids curl up in that cramped truck for another night. He dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled handful of change. The coins, rusted and rough, clinked against his palm. It wasn't much, barely anything, and the sight of it tightened his chest. But it was all he had. He turned the key. The old engine coughed awake, growling low, and he eased the truck down the highway toward town. Up ahead, a roadside motel came into view. The wooden sign was weathered to the bone, paint peeling, the neon flickering like it was ready to die out. Daniel pulled over and checked the rearview mirror. Lily was slumped against him, still asleep, her teddy bear pinned tight to her chest. Jacob, too, was out cold, his dirty face soft with exhaustion, both small hands gripping his father's shirt as if letting go meant losing him for good. Daniel turned away. He couldn't bring himself to wake them yet. He stepped out, his shoes heavy with mud and water. The office door opened with a metallic jingle from the old bell. Behind the counter sat a man whose eyes flickered with suspicion, then dulled into boredom. Daniel laid out every coin he had onto the desk. The man counted quickly, sighed, then slid over a key to a ground floor room. Daniel picked it up, gave a faint nod instead of words. His voice was too raw, too dry to carry thanks. Back at the truck, he opened the door gently and lifted the kids out, one by one. Lily stirred, eyes half open, head dropping back onto his shoulder. Jacob rubbed at his eyes, but his fingers stayed hooked in the fabric of Daniel's coat, hanging on like the world might slip away if he let go. Daniel carried them down a narrow hall, dim lights casting long stains of shadow across walls marked by water damage. The door swung open to a room that smelled of mold. The sheets were worn thin, the pillows stiff, the walls patched with water stains that had spread over years of leaks. He set the kids down on the bed. Lily curled up instantly, still hugging her teddy. Jacob tucked himself tight, eyes closed but one hand reaching until it found his father's. Daniel sat on the edge of the mattress, watching them sink into sleep. The place was cold, musty, heavy with the scent of old rain. But it had a roof, and for now, that was enough. Daniel pulled a thin blanket over their shoulders before leaning back against the wall, ice tracing the cracked ceiling. The night before still echoed in his head, the slam of the door, Jacob's question, Marianne's empty stare. Fear pressed down on him, whispering that the past might repeat itself. But looking at those small faces resting easy, he knew he couldn't fold. He tugged off his wet shoes, set them neatly in the corner, and stayed seated for a long while, the damp wall cool against his back. Outside, the rain had eased, but inside him, the storm was still churning. He closed his eyes and let himself breathe slow, listening to the steady rhythm of the children's breath. That quiet chorus pulled him back, reminding him he still had a reason to keep moving. His calloused hand rested on the edge of the bed until his fingers brushed Jacob's. The boy's grip tightened in sleep, pulling Daniel out of the dark spiral in his mind and anchoring him here. Whatever he'd lost, whatever doors had closed on him, he still had these two. As long as they were beside him, he'd find a way to survive. In the dim light leaking through the tattered curtain, Daniel sat watch over Lily and Jacob's sleep. Every car passing outside, every footstep in the hall, he caught it, like a soldier still used to keeping guard. But this time, he wasn't guarding brothers in arms. He was guarding the last pieces of his life that mattered. The shabby room couldn't give him peace. But inside him, a thin light glowed, weak but steady. He knew the road ahead would be long. Still, under the sleeky ceiling, with the kids breathing steady in their sleep, he'd found something he hadn't felt in years, a beginning. Fragile, weary, but real. The days that followed dragged Daniel into the grind of his new life. Before the sun even rose above the gray rooftops, he was already out the door of the motel, leaving Lily and Jacob curled up under a thin blanket. The wooden door clicked shut behind him, the sound small but heavy, like it sealed away the bit of peace he wished his kids could have. He walked quickly down the damp street, mist still rising from the puddles left over from last night's rain. He searched for work wherever he could. Handwritten help-wanted signs taped to windows, nailed crooked to telephone poles, stuck in the dirt outside warehouses. Every time he stepped inside, people's eyes scanned him head to toe, lingering on his worn-out jacket, his cracked shoes. Most just shook their heads before he got a word out. Some places didn't even let him finish his sentence. Daniel swallowed it down, carrying a quiet fear that his time as a soldier had left him with nothing useful, that hands trained to hold a rifle meant little when it came to lifting, stacking, hauling. At last, a warehouse on the edge of town took him in. The manager didn't ask much, just glanced at his broad back and shoved a pair of frayed gloves at him. The work was simple: haul boxes, morning to night. Wooden crates that stank of chemicals cut into his shoulders every time he lifted them, his back burning under the weight. Sweat mixed with dust and the sour smell of grease, running down his chest, soaking through his faded shirt. On the first day, he buckled under a box nearly twice his size. His knees slammed the concrete floor, sharp pain shooting up his legs. But he didn't cry out. He thought about the kids asleep at the motel, thought about the meager food they had, and forced himself up. His hands shook, his back bent low, but this time he carried the box to where it needed to go. The manager barely looked. No praise, no scolding. Daniel understood. Here, you only had to keep standing. Nobody asked for more. At the end of the day, the wages pressed into his hand were pitiful, crumpled bills so few he didn't dare count them twice. But when he unlocked the motel door and saw his children's faces peek out, he managed to smile. Dinner was just a few cans of cheap noodles from the discount store. He opened them, the oily smell rising sharp, then split the contents into 3 plastic bowls. Jacob dug in, dipping dry bread into the broth, chewing hard with small teeth that struggled to tear each bite. Lily glanced at her brother, then quietly pushed some of her portion toward him, her hand trembling even as she tried to hide it. Daniel saw it. His chest tightened, but he said nothing. He pretended not to notice, slipped a dry crust he'd saved in his pocket onto the table, breaking it in 2 so each child had a piece. The neon light overhead flickered, casting a cold glow on the cheap plastic table. Daniel sat across from his kids, chewing slowly, swallowing not just food but the bitterness inside him. The scrape of plastic spoons against the bowls filled the silence, steady, like the tick of a clock marking time in that cramped room. Afterward, he gathered the empty cans, stacked them neatly in a bag, not wanting to risk a fine if they were left out. At night, he spread the thin blanket on the floor, giving the bed to his children. Curled together, they drifted into sleep, their breathing steady. Daniel leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on them. In the dark, memories of war flashed like lightning, explosions, smoke, the faces of brothers who never came back. Fear crept in, whispering he wouldn't make it here, that he'd break under the weight of ordinary life. But then the rhythm of his children's breath pulled him back, grounding him. Every morning, before leaving, he tucked the blanket tighter around them, placed the teddy bear close against Lily's chest, and locked the door. Every night, after his body was worn and his back stiff with pain, he still leaned over a pot of instant noodles, dividing it evenly into 3. Days passed this way, hard, but steady. And in that steadiness, Daniel began to realize he still had endurance left in him. One evening, after a long day of hauling boxes, he walked into the motel room and found his kids waiting at the table. Their eyes lit up when they saw him, and that light alone eased some of the weight in his chest. For a moment, the fear of war, of the past, loosened its grip. He understood then, no matter how poor, no matter how rough, every meal together was its own piece of resilience. In that damp little room, the smell of cheap noodles mixing with mildew, Daniel chewed slowly, his eyes on every small gesture his kids made. He didn't need to say a word. The silence between them was enough. It was a promise. A promise that they would never have to ask him again, "Dad, what did I do wrong?" Morning light leaked through the worn motel curtain, falling across Daniel's tired face. He had been awake long before, sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, staring out at the oil-stained parking lot. The kids were still curled up under the thin blanket, their breathing steady but heavy, like little lungs carrying a weight far too big for their age. Daniel brushed a hand over their hair, then stood, bending to knot the frayed laces of his shoes. The knots held, but never tight enough to hide the unease he carried inside. He knew short shifts wouldn't cut it. The small paycheck from the warehouse barely covered the room, the canned noodles, and a few scraps of bread. He needed more hours, more than his body even wanted to think about. But to take the longer shifts, he had to find someone to watch the kids. He couldn't leave Lily and Jacob locked in that damp room all day. They walked with him down a street of sagging buildings, doors with peeling paint, signs weathered by years. The first daycare sat behind a faded yellow wall, its window draped with an old green curtain. Daniel stepped in, Lily clutching his hand tight, Jacob pressed close to his leg. The woman at the desk glanced up, her eyes flat, like looking through glass. Daniel explained, his voice rough from sleepless nights. She cut him off with a quick shake of her head. No space. 2 words, clipped and final. Daniel swallowed, nodded once, and turned away. Lily's hand trembled slightly in his, but she said nothing. At the second daycare, brighter and tidier with a white picket fence, children laughed inside, chasing plastic balls. The manager looked him up and down, lingering on his worn jacket and cracked shoes. Daniel laid out what papers he had: birth certificates, a photocopy of his ID. She slid them back across the desk. Not enough paperwork. We can't accept them. Her tone was softer than the first, but the wall was just as solid. Daniel picked up the papers, folded them back into his pocket. Lily watched him, like she wanted to ask something, but stayed quiet. The third daycare had fresh paint, lights glowing inside, neat rows of chairs and tables. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He spoke, explained, waited. The woman behind the polished desk listened, nodding slightly. Then she named a registration fee higher than a week's worth of his hard labor. The number echoed in his head, heavy as a gunshot. His chest tightened. He knew he couldn't. He thanked her softly, voice breaking, and walked his children back out. By then the sun was stronger, their 3 shadows stretching long across the cracked sidewalk. Each step felt like hauling stone. Lily slowed, clutching her teddy bear, eyes downcast. Jacob whispered, his voice small as the breeze, "They don't want us, do they, Dad?" Every word pierced Daniel's skin like a needle. He didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on their hands and walked faster, as if he could outrun the question. The street was hot, car exhaust mixing with the stench of asphalt, burning his throat. Daniel stopped under a tree, wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes rimmed red. For a moment, the war rushed back, running through dust and heat in search of water, moving bunker to bunker, hearing fate's no in the form of shellfire. That helpless feeling hadn't changed much. The only difference now was the 2 small hands clutching his, reminding him he couldn't stop moving. By late afternoon, he led them back into the motel room. He dropped the suitcase by the wall, pulled the children close, wiped their damp foreheads. Lily sat on the bed with her teddy bear, staring at the yellow-stained wall, silent. Jacob leaned into his father's shoulder and sighed. Daniel sat between them, wrapping them both in his arms. In that silence, fear rose up sharp. Fear that no place would ever open its doors to them, fear that rejection would follow them forever. But something else formed inside him too, something steady, the same thing that had carried him through foxholes and smoke. Back then, when cornered, he had found a way out. And now he would again. Even if every door shut in his face, he couldn't let go. He would keep knocking, keep searching. His children needed him, and he needed to keep the vow he'd made on that first stormy night: never let them believe they were the ones at fault. Outside, the sky turned gray. The last light of day slipped through the curtain's edge, throwing the shadow of the 3 of them against the blotched wall. Daniel sat there, drained but unbroken. And in his tired eyes, a faint glow still burned, like an ember refusing to die out. He knew tomorrow he'd step out again, and the next day, and the one after. Somewhere out there, he believed, a door would stay open for the 3 of them. Evening fell over the town like a damp blanket, heavy and cold. The sky was flat, the color of ash, no clear line between cloud and rooftop. After a day of nothing but refusals, Daniel walked slowly down the quiet street, gripping his children's hands as if a strong gust might blow them away. Lily's hand was cold as water. Jacob stumbled, his small shoes soaked through. Daniel's knees ached, every step dragging, the exhaustion settling deep in the circles under his eyes. What grew inside his chest wasn't just fatigue, it was a kind of despair planting roots in the deepest part of him. At the end of the street stood a wooden gate. The paint was flaking off in sheets, the lower boards rotting, the grain warped and dark like an old memory. Daniel stopped without meaning to, not because it promised anything, but because there was the faint sound of a chair shifting on a porch. An old widow sat there, her heavy sweater unraveling at the cuffs, her hands folded in front of her as if holding on to years that had already slipped away. Her hair was short, clean, white against her neck. In front of her, a cup of tea steamed gently, carrying the scent of cinnamon. When she lifted her eyes to the three of them, they weren't sharp or suspicious. They were tired, yes, but kindly tired, the way someone opens a window in the morning just to let air in, not expecting anything else. Daniel stood outside the gate. No words ready, no plea rehearsed. He had used up his begging all day, traded every scrap of pride for headshakes and closed doors. Now he only stood there, as if the rain had washed him up and left him waiting in front of this sagging gate. Lily tucked herself against his side, teddy bear soaked and matted in her arms. Jacob stared at the old woman with dark, cautious eyes, measuring if this porch was safe. The woman's gaze lingered on the children. For a second, it seemed to pass right through Daniel, into the empty space behind him, the sleepless nights, the thin meals, the endless refusals. She unlatched the gate, the wood groaning, and opened it just wide enough. Her voice was low, rough, not pitying, not commanding, just plain, like talking about the weather. "They can stay here a few hours." Daniel bowed his head. No words of thanks. In the service, salvation sometimes came just like this: a canteen passed down the line, an empty foxhole, a lamplit without asking where the power came from. On this porch, mercy looked like a nod, fragile as the steam rising from tea, steady as that worn-out gate. The house was small, wooden walls the color of old honey. The hall narrow, the floor creaking under each step. On the walls, a few black and white photos, a Marine in uniform standing on a beach, staring into the lens, a young couple sitting on the hood of a pickup, fingers intertwined. Daniel didn't stop to study them, but the images brushed past him, carrying the faint scent of salt air. Some stories don't need to be told, everyone understands them just by what's left behind. She had lost her own, and from then on, this house had lived in quiet. The old woman spread a worn kitchen towel over a small table, set down 2 plastic cups, and poured warm milk from a dented pot. Lily held her cup with both hands, blowing gently, her shoulders easing bit by bit. Jacob placed his teddy bear on the chair beside him, fixing its torn ear as if mending the world in the only way he knew how. Daniel stood by the door, watching it all like a man outside a chapel, afraid to step in too far, afraid to disturb something fragile. He pulled a few wrinkled bills from his pocket, set them on the table. She didn't even glance down, just pushed them back toward him, firm but gentle. No promises, no contracts, no talk of paperwork, phone numbers, or rules. The agreement was signed another way, in the way she pulled a chair close enough so Lily's feet could touch the floor, in the way she set down a plate of broken cookies in the middle without counting pieces. Daniel understood, there are laws older than any paperwork, and they still hold, so long as people believe in them. In the kitchen, the wall clock ticked quietly. Time no longer pressed down, but tied this single afternoon together. Daniel leaned against the doorway, eyes fixed on the kids. It had been a long time since he'd seen them drink something warm, a long time since his own hands had stopped trembling. He realized that the shaking wasn't just from fatigue, but from fear, the fear of having no one when you needed someone, the fear that no place would take you in. For now, that fear had a seat at the table, quiet as any guest. Evening light came through the small window, catching dust motes in the air. They spun slowly, glinting, like a silver calm draped across the room. The old woman washed a dish, water running soft. Lily dipped her cookie into the milk. Jacob propped the teddy upright against his cup, as if it, too, needed something to lean on. Daniel felt his spine loosen a little. In the army, he had learned to sleep with his back against a wall to guard against being startled awake. Now he was learning to lean into kindness, thin though it was, just to take one deeper breath. He checked the clock, measured a few hours by the habits of a soldier, how long to walk back to the warehouse, how much time to squeeze in another shift, how long to return before the sky turned dark. The math never added up clean, but always ended with the picture of his kids framed in this doorway. He nodded once to the woman, laid a hand on Jacob's shoulder, brushed Lily's damp hair. No promises spoken, the promise was already there. They could stay, and he would come back. When he stepped onto the porch, the evening breeze carried the smell of damp earth. The gate closed behind him, not with a slam but with the quiet click of wood meeting latch. Daniel stood in the road a moment, drawing a deep breath. The town was still worn, still poor, but now the road ahead had a thin streak of light running alongside it, a path for those who came unprepared, but not unwanted. His stride was stronger than in the morning. In his head he mapped the hours, the miles, the pennies to collect. Small calculations, but woven together, they formed a net tight enough to carry the three of them through another night. Despair hadn't gone. It had just stepped back, making room for what had to be done: work, return, and open that gate again. By nightfall, when he came back, the kitchen light glowed warm through the window. Lily and Jacob were on the rug, fitting scraps of wood into the shape of a bridge. Their teddy bear stood guard at the top like a sentry. The old woman looked at Daniel, gave no speech, only a nod. The same nod from earlier, like signing once more an unwritten agreement. On the walk back to the motel, Daniel felt the hollow in his chest wasn't so empty. They were still poor, still worn thin, but now there was an address to knock on. A porch where cinnamon tea and the tick of a clock could soften the edges of a wasted afternoon. A person who had lost as he had, and knew how to open a gate with nothing but decency. That night, with Lily and Jacob asleep, Daniel leaned against the wall, listening to the faint traffic outside. He closed his eyes, breathing with the rhythm of his children's sleep, and knew one thing for certain: despair wasn't the final verdict. Somewhere, behind flaking paint and old gates, there were still people willing to unlatch the lock. Somewhere, among the refusals, a voice remained calm enough to say, "They can stay here a few hours." And sometimes, that was enough to help a father get up and face another day. That night, the town had gone quiet, most of the lights already out. Now and then the sound of a car engine drifted by, then faded, leaving a heavy silence pressed over the small motel room. Daniel sat on the floor, his back against a damp-stained wall, the old suitcase beside him still caked with dried mud from that first rainy night. Lily and Jacob were asleep, each in their own corner of the sagging bed, the teddy bear stretched between them like an invisible boundary. The neon light overhead flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow that deepened the lines at the corners of Daniel's eyes. He opened the suitcase, meaning only to straighten the mess of clothes and papers. His rough hand brushed against something solid, tucked away in the corner. When he pulled it out, he found a small metal box, rusted, scarred at the edges like it had been thrown around too many times. It smelled of damp iron, the kind of scent that clings to old basements. Daniel sat still for a moment, his palm on the lid, his heartbeat quickening. He knew this was the box Uncle Samuel had left him, handed over on a quiet afternoon before the man passed. He forced the latch open. The rusty hinge groaned, flakes breaking loose and sticking to his fingers, staining them the color of dried blood. When the lid came free, the smell of old paper rushed out, dense, musty, like memories sealed too long. There was no gold, no shine inside. Just a yellowed envelope, its edges brittle, a heavy old bank key, and a few faded documents, ink blurred by years. Daniel picked up the envelope, the paper fragile in his hand, as if it held the last breath of the past. On the front, in crooked handwriting, "For Daniel, when you are ready." He ran his thumb along the letters, remembering Samuel, quiet, spare with words, raising him on simple meals and half-finished stories about honesty, always leaving Daniel to figure out the rest on his own. The bank key lay at the bottom, dull metal but still catching light in the flicker. Daniel turned it in his hand. It was cold, heavy. The chill seeped into his chest, made him shiver. It felt less like a tool and more like a burden waiting its time. The papers beneath showed old financial records, numbers and dates he didn't yet understand, but he knew they tied to a part of Samuel's life, one lived quietly, ending without noise. Daniel spread the contents out on the floor, staring at them under the weak light. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from a fear he knew well. He feared that inside that envelope lay more than he could carry. He feared the key might open not salvation but another kind of battlefield, one without gunfire, but just as dangerous. He lifted his eyes toward the bed. Lily shifted, her small arm wrapping tight around the teddy bear. Jacob's brow furrowed in sleep, caught in some rough dream. Daniel drew a long breath. The fear in him shifted, giving way to something else, the understanding that his real fight wasn't buried in the past. It was here, in the present, where two children needed him every hour of every day. The letter and the key might be inheritance, might be one last message. Or just another wait. Either way, he knew he'd have to face it. He leaned back against the wall, the envelope in his hand. Sweat broke along his temple, running down into the rust stains on his cheek. In that moment he felt something turn inside him, fear beginning to give way to resolve. The box didn't just hold papers. It held a truth, that sometimes a man has to open what's been locked away if he wants to move forward. The night dragged on, the clock ticking faintly in the room. Daniel sat in the cramped space, letter and key still in his grip. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't read a word, but a different light flickered in his eyes. He would read. He would find out. He would take whatever came. Because only by doing that could he clear a path for his children, instead of letting the past and the present keep tearing him apart. Outside the window, the dark pressed in. Inside, under the weak, buzzing lamp, Daniel sat with his hands dirty from rust, but his gaze steadier than before. A quiet ember of resolve had lit in him, small, but enough. Enough to remind him of the vow he'd made that first night in the rain, never let his children believe they were the ones at fault. Daniel sat frozen for a long time before he dared open the letter. Outside, the night had thickened, the neon bulb in the room flickering, throwing pale light against yellowed walls. Lily and Jacob's breathing was steady on the bed, broken only by the creak of the window frame shifting in the wind. Daniel turned the envelope over in his hands, afraid that if he pressed too hard it might crumble into dust. At last, he slipped a finger under the flap and tore it open. The sound was dry and brittle, like a branch snapping in winter. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded into quarters, the ink faded, blotchy in places. The handwriting trembled, but it was still legible. Daniel squinted, tracing each line. When you are worn out, remember. What we leave behind is not only money, but a chance to live decently. Daniel read it slowly, repeating the words under his breath as if they were a password. The sentence was short, but it hit him hard. He didn't yet know what the bank key meant, didn't know what weight it carried, but after days of rejection and exhaustion, those words landed like a hand on his shoulder. There was still a road, still a way out. He lowered the letter onto his lap and leaned back against the wall, eyes drifting up to the stained ceiling, watermarks shaping themselves into strange patterns. In his mind, Uncle Samuel came back, the tall, thin frame, the quiet eyes, the calloused hand that always rested on his shoulder when he faltered. Live decently, Samuel used to say, his voice deep but plain. Back then, Daniel never imagined those simple words would feel like a lifeline years later. He gripped the bank key still in his hand. It was cold and heavy, yet in that chill Daniel felt something warm begin to stir. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was duty. He didn't know. But a small flame had been lit inside his chest. He turned to look at the children. Lily lay on her side, clutching the teddy bear close, her chest rising gently with each breath. Jacob had rolled toward the wall, his hands still fisted in the blanket as if holding on to the last patch of safety he had. They slept, but in their sleep Daniel saw how fragile they were. He knew he couldn't waste time. Every day lived like this was another piece of their childhood stolen. He bent and read the letter again. The words etched themselves deeper, a chance to live decently. Samuel hadn't pointed to money as salvation, but as a tool, a bridge that might lift someone from the mud if they stepped carefully. Daniel understood now, his uncle hadn't left him something to make life easy, but something to remind him of what mattered. Staying, carrying on, holding to kindness even in the storm. The familiar fear was still there, the worry about what tomorrow would bring never far away. But now, mixed with it, came a different feeling, resilience. Not because Daniel knew he'd succeed, but because he knew he couldn't turn away from the chance sitting in his hands. He folded the letter carefully, like it was a map, and placed it back in the rusty box with the key. Closing the lid, the latch snapped shut with a faint click. The sound echoed in the quiet room, not like something locked away, but like a promise sealed. He would open this path, he would follow it, not just for himself, but for Lily and Jacob. Late into the night, he stayed at the edge of the bed, one hand on Jacob's back, the other brushing Lily's hair. The pale glow from the bulb fell over the three of them, a thin curtain hiding the scars in their hearts. Daniel drew a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't tremble. Hope wasn't big enough to banish the storm, but it was enough to lift his head toward what lay ahead. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the smell of damp earth from the last rain. Daniel closed his eyes, repeating the words of the letter. And in that cramped, shadowed motel room, a father who thought he had nothing left felt something flicker alive inside him, a small flame of chance, of hope, and of the decency his uncle had trusted him to carry forward. The morning fog lay heavy over the town, draining what little color there was. Daniel gripped the wheel of the old truck, his kids bundled in the back seat under a thin blanket. He dropped them off with the old widow, then turned the truck around, heart pounding. On the seat beside him sat the yellowed envelope and the bank key, proof of something larger, but also a weight pressing harder on his shoulders. The street where the lawyer's office stood was quiet. Shops still shuttered, crooked wooden signs swayed in the wind, a light pole groaned under the pull of sagging wires. Daniel parked along the curb and stepped out, adjusting the collar of his worn coat without thinking. He looked up at the small iron sign hanging over the door, David Parker, attorney at law. The paint had faded, letters chipped, but the words still clear. The door opened with a creak. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and coffee long gone cold. A scratched wooden desk filled most of the room, stacked with files and thick bundles of paper. A couple of broken pencils lay scattered nearby. The neon light buzzed overhead, casting its pale glow across Daniel's weary face. In the window's reflection, he saw himself, sunken eyes, hunched shoulders, the weight of a whole winter in his stare. He sat down in the rickety chair across from the desk. It groaned under him, as though protesting the years he carried. He laid the envelope and the key on the table. He didn't push them forward, didn't pull his hands back. They just sat there, catching the light, like secrets nobody wanted to touch. David Parker, a middle-aged man with gray streaking his hair, sat across. He didn't say much, only tilted his head, studying Daniel for a moment. The old scars at the edge of his collar, the rough hands resting on the desk. Parker had seen plenty of veterans before. But in Daniel, he read something else, the fear of losing his children. Daniel drew a long breath and began to speak. His voice was raw, breaking now and then, as if each word had to be dragged from a deep, dark place. He spoke of the 4 years away, of the door slammed in his face, of dinners of canned noodles, of knocking on daycares only to be turned away. Parker never interrupted, just scratched quick notes into a notebook. His pen moved steadily, like the distant drumbeat of a march. When Daniel spoke of his fear that Marianne might come back to claim the kids, Parker's eyes sharpened for a moment. He'd seen it before, parents gone for years, returning with plans. He offered no judgment, only flipped to a clean page, his voice low. We need to prepare everything. Documents, witnesses, proof of how you've cared for them. Daniel nodded slightly. He lowered his head, opened the envelope, and handed Parker the letter. The lawyer read it in silence, brows drawn. He set it down without comment on the money or what it might mean, just tapped his fingers on the desk, steady and deliberate. Good, he said quietly. But remember, this isn't a fight about money. It's a fight about being a father. Daniel sat still, the words echoing inside him. He thought back to nights on guard duty overseas, when just a single nod from a commander was enough to keep the squad steady. Parker's words felt the same, short, plain, but carrying weight enough to tell him what needed to be done. The neon light flickered, shadows of the two men stretching long on the wall. Daniel looked down at his hands, veins raised, trembling. The fear of losing his children hadn't left him, but now it seemed to point toward something. He understood that to protect Lily and Jacob, he had to walk into a new kind of battle, one without bombs or gunfire, but just as tense. Before leaving, Daniel tucked the envelope and the key back into his coat. He rose, nodded in thanks. Parker returned the nod, enough to mark the first step they had taken together on a rough road ahead. Outside, the wind pushed down the empty street, carrying the tang of rusted iron from old signs. Daniel stood at the curb, staring at the darkened buildings. His hands still shook, but in his chest, the small flame Samuel's letter had lit was still burning. It reminded him that decency and resilience were the real weapons here, the papers and the lawyer were only tools. He drove back for the kids. When he saw them running from the widow's porch, hair wild in the wind, he knew why he'd sat for hours in that dim office. Not to win or lose, but to keep these smiles alive. On the ride home, the engine's growl blended with the wind. Daniel didn't speak, just reached his hand back to where Lily sat. Her small hand found his, warm and sure. In that touch, the fear and the planning settled quiet for a moment. He knew the real battle had begun. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The morning light in the office was pale, the neon flickering down onto the scratched-up desk where Daniel had laid out everything he'd gathered, Lily and Jacob's birth certificates, stacks of old motel receipts, grocery store slips, even the scraps from canned meals and stale bread, and that faded letter from Uncle Samuel. To anyone else, it would have looked like a jumble of meaningless papers. But to Daniel, every sheet was evidence. Silent proof of the months he'd spent keeping these kids alive, keeping them safe. He bent down to pick up a crumpled receipt, his hands trembling slightly as he set it on the desk. Ink from countless photocopies smeared across his fingers. Lily and Jacob sat huddled in the corner, holding onto each other. Their eyes were wide, curious but wary, sensing the weight and quiet determination pressing down from their father. Parker's calm eyes scanned every piece of paper. He picked up the yellowed letter, turning it slowly, reading the shaky handwriting. The office was still enough that you could hear the soft rustle of paper, the scratch of pencil across the legal pad. The lawyer nodded once, slow, deliberate, a nod that said he understood. He understood the strain, the exhaustion Daniel had carried. "We'll put all this together," Parker said, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. "Not to win with money, not to intimidate anyone. But to prove you're a father. A father who has given everything, day in and day out, for these kids. Every receipt, every record, it's your quiet story, your proof." Daniel looked up, eyes tired but fierce, meeting Parker's gaze, then glancing down at the children. For a moment, his chest felt heavy, but a new kind of strength stirred. He realized the power wasn't in money or legal maneuvering, it was in the small, persistent acts of care, the daily devotion, the unbroken commitment to protect them. Parker started stacking papers, organizing them by date, by relevance, by legality. Daniel wandered the room, fingertips brushing the window frame where the morning light cut patterns across the worn floorboards. He listened to the wind rustling outside, the rare hum of a passing car, sounds of a life that had slipped out of reach but was slowly returning. He thought of the battlefield, of days when every decision carried the weight of life and death. This battle was different, no explosions, no bullets. But just as demanding. Focus and patience were everything. Every ounce of heart and mind, every bit of himself, would be called upon to keep his children safe. Jacob looked up at him, wide-eyed, innocence laced with worry. Lily clutched her stuffed bear as if it were her shield against a storm she didn't fully understand. Daniel leaned down, resting his hand on Lily's head, feeling the softness, the warmth of life in such a small body. He thought silently, "I will not give up. I can't. Not now. Not ever." Parker paused, meeting Daniel's eyes. There was seriousness, but also reassurance there. "Every detail, every receipt, every birth certificate, it's your silent voice. When they try to tell a different story, this record will speak louder than words." Daniel nodded. His heart raced, his breath came faster, but underneath it, a rare calm had started to settle, a kind of resilience. Each small step he took today would shape the future for Lily and Jacob. Even if Marianne tried to belittle him, even if others sneered, he had the strongest weapon of all, truth, and a father's love that refused to fade. Daniel sat down quietly at the defense table. Head low, both hands on the file, thumb rubbing the crease of the cover as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. From top to bottom, he had nothing to show but his presence, a veteran in a worn shirt, face drawn, eyes locked on the papers in his hands. Inside the courtroom, the judge sat high at the bench, gavel resting beside him. Light streamed through the windows, catching the dust in the air, making the room feel heavier than stone. Pages turned, chairs creaked, the small noises piling together into a suffocating hum. When testimony began, the first to be read was the widow's journal. Thin pages, shaky handwriting, but every word rang true. Lily and Jacob playing in her yard, Daniel dropping off a few dollars before rushing to his night shift, the simple meals he managed to put together. The clerk's voice was flat, but those words burned like small flames in the cold wall closing around Daniel. Then came the teacher's account. She wrote of Jacob sitting silent for hours, of Lily falling asleep at her desk after long nights unsettled. She wrote of the change she saw once they were with their father, still poor, but steadier, safer. The words stable and safe kept repeating, the very things Marianne's case tried to erase. Daniel lifted his eyes, just for a second, catching Marianne's face tightening, lips pressed hard. Franklin shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on his thigh, his confidence thinning. Daniel didn't move. He didn't react. He only gripped the edges of his file tighter. In his head, Parker's words played back, each small piece, put together, makes the picture of justice. And now, those pieces were starting to fit a widow's shaky script, a teacher's plain notes, forming the outline of a father who hadn't quit. The air in the courtroom thickened. The recorder whirred faintly, the ceiling fan groaned overhead. Outside the glass, daylight was breaking, but inside, the weight didn't lift. Each minute stretched like an hour. Every tap of the clerk's pen struck like a clock hammer. Daniel looked down at his file. His messy notes, the faded receipts, the smudged numbers, they weren't pretty, but they were lined up, square. They were truth. In that moment, he realized he no longer feared the war's shadows cutting into his present. These fragile pieces of paper, like that broken plastic deer standing on the shelf, still held firm. When the gavel cracked, calling the next phase, Daniel drew in a deep breath. His chest ached like it was pinned under stone, but the breath came long and steady, keeping him upright. Sweat slid down the back of his neck, his hands pressed on the file. Nobody knew what he heard in that instant, whether it was his boy's small voice asking, "Dad, can this be fixed?" or his daughter's whisper as she clutched her stuffed bear. But it was those imagined sounds that kept him steady, in a room heavy as lead, but not heavy enough to crush his will. Outside, the day was breaking clear, but inside the courtroom it all stayed thick, unyielding. And at the center of it, a soldier returned home, silent, clutching a file as if holding his children, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be laid bare. The screen in the middle of the courtroom had sat dark and silent, like a closed door. When the technician nodded at the judge, a quick click sounded. The light shifted, and the room dropped into complete silence. The images needed no introduction. On the screen appeared a familiar porch, a weak yellow bulb casting down while rain hammered in heavy sheets. Marianne stood in the doorway, coat pulled tight, an old suitcase in her hand. She let it fall to the wet step, the thud caught by the doorbell's microphone, dry and sharp like a gavel strike. Behind her, two children shook in the rain. Lily clutched her teddy bear, Jacob pressed himself against his father's leg. Daniel's figure appeared, soaked through, his old field jacket streaked with road dust, his hand gripping the strap of his duffel. The footage wasn't edited, wasn't rushed. It was just the truth, caught by an unfeeling eye. Marianne's voice came from the speakers, firm, cold. She waved them off, then slammed the door. In the frame, Daniel froze, his hand half raised toward the doorframe. Lily's sob caught in the microphone, sharp enough to make the room stiffen. Jacob looked up, lips trembling. "Dad, did I do something wrong?" His voice was small, but through the speakers it echoed, hitting the courtroom ceiling like a hammer. The clip lingered a moment longer, then shifted. Behind Marianne, Franklin came into view. He leaned against the frame, arms folded, the corner of his mouth bent into a smug grin. He said nothing, he didn't have to. The look alone was enough, contempt, a man savoring another's collapse. Rainlight cut across his face, making that grin colder. In the courtroom, no one breathed loud. Even the sound of air drawing in felt heavy. Marianne's lawyer stared down, clicking his pen. Marianne herself kept her eyes fixed on the screen, her face pale now, staring at her own image, shutting the door, leaving her children outside in the rain. The judge said nothing, just tilted her head, eyes steady on the screen. Daniel sat still at the defense table, both hands resting on his file. His fingers trembled, but his eyes stayed calm. He didn't need to explain. Everything that mattered was right there, clearer than any words. When the clip ended, the screen went black again, reflecting Franklin's ashen face. The air stayed thick until the scrape of a metal chair broke it. Two plainclothes officers stepped in, their shoes sharp on the tile. They moved straight for Franklin. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder. For a split second, he flinched, eyes wide, that smug grin collapsing like ash. His face drained, lips twitching soundless. He started to twist away, but the officer's grip locked him upright. The snap of handcuffs rang out, metallic and final. The courtroom froze. Marianne sat stiff, her hands clenched white in her lap, eyes locked on the cuffs. The lawyer at her side tugged her sleeve, but she didn't move. She stared at the steel, like seeing for the first time the pit under her feet. Daniel didn't speak. He just glanced once, then lowered his eyes back to the file. Inside him, a heavy emptiness. No triumph, only fatigue. But in that fatigue, something firmer, a certainty. The scraps he'd gathered, the receipts, the shaky signatures, had all found their place in the larger truth. When Franklin was let out, the sound of boots echoed down the hall. The courtroom door swung closed, louder than usual, as if the air itself needed more time to absorb the shock. For a moment, every eye shifted to Daniel. He didn't change expression. He sat steady, eyes forward, like a soldier still braced in a bunker after the barrage. The judge struck her gavel, 3 solid cracks. Her voice came steady, low, as she called the court to continue. No one raised their voice. But everyone there knew the balance had tipped. Not with shouting, not with long arguments, but with the cold eye of a doorbell camera, a witness that couldn't be denied. Daniel sat with one hand on his file, the other resting unconsciously against his chest, where he used to carry the little plastic deer. His heartbeat came steady now, not shaking. And he understood, what needed saying had already been shown. There was no need to cry out anymore. The courtroom door closed behind him, the echo of the gavel still faint in his ears. The long hallway outside felt brighter, the glass ceiling spilling down a thin line of sunlight, like a damp cloth laid across a fevered brow. Daniel stopped for a beat, the file pressed to his chest, the smell of old paper and last night's rain still clinging to his collar. Everything felt a little lighter, though his legs didn't yet know it. They held him steady, the way a soldier stays upright after a shelling, waiting for the order to move. The cry came first. High and sharp, unrestrained. It cut through the shuffle of shoes on marble and the low murmur of voices, striking straight into the softest part of him. Lily came running, hair in a tangle, her teddy bear jammed under her arm, its frayed ear bouncing with each step. Jacob trailed close behind, his tiny shoes slapping quick against the floor, his face flushed, his eyes wide as if the hallway itself might vanish if he slowed down. Daniel dropped the file onto a bench, dropped to his knees on the cold stone, arms opening by instinct. The impact of 2 small bodies hit his chest hard enough to knock him back half a step. He held them tight. The smell of milk, sun, and damp laundry pressed against him all at once. It was the smell of home. Lily buried her face in his neck, her shoulders shaking, the teddy bear wedged between them like a seal pressed against a border. Jacob's little arms gripped his back, his fingers clutching at the fabric of Daniel's shirt, his breath pounding quick against his ribs. Daniel pulled them closer, tighter, so tight he was afraid he'd hurt them, but the fear of losing them again was greater. He lowered his forehead to their hair and let his tears sink into it. The hallway quieted. People slowed, stepped aside, voices dropped. A slice of spring light slid along the wall, catching Daniel's worn shoulder, then Lily's damp cheek, then Jacob's wet lashes. The tears glistened, drying into faint streaks like pencil marks in a notebook, proof enough, without words. Daniel eased his grip, just enough to see their faces. Lily looked thinner, but her eyes carried a strength that only comes from standing against the wind. Jacob seemed taller, his jaw clenched as if he were trying to hold back sobs. Daniel brushed the hair from Lily's eye with his thumb, placed his other hand on Jacob's neck, pulling him close, feeling the boy's heartbeat slow under his palm. He said only 2 words, low enough not to break the hush around them: "I'm here." The words fell warm and small, like a smooth stone set in an open hand. Lily gave the faintest nod. Jacob swallowed hard, blinking fast, then both pressed themselves against him again, testing if his arms would still be there, if they'd open again tomorrow. Sunlight shifted outside, breaking through the clouds. Dust rose in the window frame, swirling slow in the beam. From his place on the floor, Daniel lifted his head. The high ceiling didn't seem as heavy now. The marble floor looked less like stone and more like still water, reflecting the shape of 3 people holding on. He gathered the file back onto his knee, then wrapped his free arm around his children again. The paper crinkled, the cardboard edge scraping his skin. He didn't mind. Those pages, old receipts, the widow's notes, the teacher's reports, were heavy enough to remind him the wall had been built, brick by brick, from the first day one expenses to the doorbell camera's silent witness. But the wall wasn't meant to shut anyone out. It was meant to hold his children in. Lily lifted her teddy, its ear wet and coming loose. Daniel smoothed it down, tucked it back under her arm. Jacob's fingers pressed against his chest pocket, feeling the small lump inside. Daniel paused, then gave a faint smile. The little plastic deer was still there, its glued leg holding. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. Just knowing it stood was enough. Like the 3 of them standing there in the hallway, steady against the noise and the stairs. Time slid by like rain on glass. The hallway sounds crept back, footsteps, doors opening and closing, but his arms didn't move. Slowly, Daniel stood, lifting both kids at once. His arms tightened, his body finding a rhythm strong enough to hold them both. Lily's arms circled his neck, Jacob's cheek pressed to his shoulder, each of them taking their side as if they'd practiced it all along. He walked a few steps down the hall, slow and even. The spring light followed, drying the wet streaks on their faces, warming the damp collar of his shirt. Each step eased the weight he carried, not because it was gone, but because it was the right weight, the kind that anchored him to the ground. Near the doorway, he stopped. A cool breeze swept in, carrying the scent of new leaves. Daniel tilted his head, letting the light fall across Lily's face, letting Jacob close his eyes a moment. No talk of verdicts, no mention of records or filings. That could come later. Now, all that mattered was steadying their breaths, stopping their hands from trembling, keeping his own heart from skipping. He set them down but kept his hands wide across their backs, like a blanket. Lily wiped her face with the back of her hand, Jacob drew in a sharp breath, and both looked up at him, tired, trusting, no longer afraid. Daniel nodded once, slow, sure. The sun rose a little higher, brightening the last damp traces into pale salt lines. At the end of the hall, the glass doors opened just wide enough. Daniel took their hands, the file tucked under his arm, and walked toward the light. No fanfare, no cheers. Just the warmth of early sun, enough to dry what tears remained, and gentle enough to remind them that from here, whatever the road looked like, they'd walk it together. The new house sat quietly on a calm street, its roof a deep red, the fence painted white. Out back stood an old maple tree, its branches spread wide. Daniel had hung an old rope there, fastened a plank to it, and turned it into a swing. Something so simple became endless joy. Every afternoon, children's laughter rose and spilled across the yard, breaking into pieces among the leaves. Lily clutched her dress, her hair flying, shouting each time her father gave her a hard push. Jacob followed right after, stretching his small hand to catch the sunlight. Daniel sat on the porch steps, sleeves rolled up, calloused hand wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. He watched in silence, the corner of his mouth lifting, no broad smile, just a faint curve he kept to himself. All the wounds, the papers, the battles were behind him now. What was left was steady breathing, small feet running over the grass, and the creak of a swing. Sometimes Marianne appeared. She didn't step inside, didn't call out, only stood at a distance beyond the fence, watching the children in silence. Her figure seemed thinner, her shoulders bent, her eyes carrying more than words could explain. Lily and Jacob would notice now and then, their hands would pause, their eyes flicker. But Daniel would place a gentle hand on their shoulders and whisper, "Your mother lost her way, but she's still your mother." No blame, no wall put up. Just an acknowledgement that the bond between mother and child never disappears, it only gets covered by shadows. On evenings like that, Daniel would watch Marian turn away, her figure small in the fading light. He didn't call after her. He knew her path was different, long, rough, and one she had to walk herself. What he could do was make sure his children understood, kindness isn't forgetting, it's keeping love a place to live. The story closes in that yard, where the wind carried the scent of grass and children's laughter cut through every dark memory. The real worth wasn't in the $1 million inheritance Uncle Samuel left, or in any deed of property, or even in the judge's words inside a courtroom. The real worth was in an afternoon under a tree, a father and his children holding steady together, choosing patience, choosing decency. And above all, in a love strong enough to hold on to what once seemed lost. When a soldier comes home, he doesn't bring glory with him, he carries the cracks in his soul and a simple longing, to sit with his children under the porch roof and hear their laughter carried in the wind. This story doesn't close with victory, but with staying to be decent, patient, and loving. And maybe, each of us has stood before that same choice, to hold on to what remains, or to let go and follow the dark. If it were you, in that moment, what would you choose to keep? Share a few thoughts in the comments, who knows, your words might be the small flame that warms someone who needs it.